The Shining is a motion picture that is loaded from top to bottom with textual clues referencing the twin genocides of America's founding, the eradication of the indigenous, and the chattel bond enslavement of Africans, as well as its progeny in the form of German Nazism.
Bartók and Penderecki, and also Ligeti, whose music appears in The Shining. It's not only the music itself and the mood that it sets and the subject matter of the music. It's the fact that these were composers. And if you go through and you look at the composers and the performers of the music throughout The Shining, including the dance tunes and all, it turns out that almost all of them were in one way affected, often catastrophically, by the Nazis in the Second World War. So it's not just a matter of their music and their political points of view, but it's their lives. Some of them as Jews. Bartók and Penderecki were not Jewish, but Bartók was, in fact, an anti-Nazi who in 1940 left Europe, had to emigrate. Penderecki was a Jewish Catholic, but he grew up in Poland in the 1930s, pretty much a contemporary of Kubrick, a little younger, and the record is clear. Well, he's on the record saying that he was deeply affected by seeing Jews taken off from his village to the extermination camps, and he says he dedicated his life in his music, or dedicated much of his music to exploring the great horror of the Holocaust. And it certainly comes through in the piece The Awakening of Jacob, 1974. Back in 2012, Penderecki said that Kubrick actually asked him if he, Penderecki, would write a score for The Shining. So Kubrick was heavily into Penderecki. And the fact that The Awakening of Jacob, like the other Penderecki pieces that are used in The Shining, are all from the Old Testament. And The Awakening of Jacob is associated with the two central horrible nightmares of The Shining, Danny's vision of the elevator disgorging blood, and Jack's dream of murdering his family. And so we've got a direct use, or rather an indirect use by Kubrick, of music that is drawn from the Hebrew Bible and which is being transformed by a Polish Catholic who witnessed the Holocaust in Poland. And I think that's an important part of establishing that there is a historical Holocaust subtext in The Shining. Now, Bartók's music is confined, and he plays over 9 minutes of it. As a matter of fact, he plays more of the Bartók that actually appears in the original composition, because it's just one movement. Music for strings, percussion, and celesta. And that music has a very moody quality to it. So Kubrick uses it early in the film to suggest there's something terribly wrong here. I don't think composers are isolated from their times. And even if that were the case, Kubrick was using this music to evoke the 1930s that, among other things, he felt as a child. So it's the music that's being used, its subject matter, its feeling, its composer's identity, its composer's experiences that fill out a discourse on the great, terrible event of that period, which was the rise of Hitler, the Second World War, and the Holocaust. So I think that's what's going on with Bartók and Penderecki, and also Ligeti, who himself was a victim of, his family was a victim of the Nazis, and he was a victim of the communists. So you've got Kubrick's being rather Catholic here, in that he'll take Ligeti's suffering under the communists as another indication of what he sees as the problem in the world, which is power and authority. It's not insignificant that at some point in the process, Kubrick noticed that he was using the music of one of the most, if not the most prominent musical opponents of the Nazis in the 1930s. And that the performance that he chose, the 1966 performance by the Berlin Philharmonic, was being conducted by Herbert von Karajan. Now, the argument that this is not significant would be that, well, the Berlin Philharmonic was a terrific orchestra, perhaps the best of its time. Herbert von Karajan was regarded at the time as arguably the finest conductor in the world. Kubrick's brother-in-law, Jan Harlan, who was an expert on music, would have contributed to this because while Kubrick knew a lot about music, Harlan knew even more. And so Harlan would have had an input on this. Now, the argument would be that there were therefore good reasons to pick that particular performance of that particular piece for this particular film, regardless of any historical context. But I'm not buying it for a minute, in part because I'm an historian, and in part because, you know, you look at Kubrick's life and he's always doing stuff like this. And he himself was fascinated with history, particularly the history of Nazi Germany. So what you get with fun, and recently learned again that Karajan and Kubrick had spoken or had met. And Karajan was on record, among other things, as saying that Stanley Kubrick is the only genius I've ever met. So there's obviously some sort of significant relationship there. At any rate, I just can't believe, given everything else we know about Kubrick and how he constructs his films and his interest in history, and the Holocaust in particular, that it's irrelevant. And that at some point in the process, he must have realized, wow, here's Bartok writing this movie that's perfect for a creepy horror film. And he wrote it in 1936. And he was an anti-Nazi who 4 years later had to flee Hitler's Europe. And I'm using a performance that's being conducted by Herbert von Karajan, who not only joined the Nazi Party, he joined it twice. He joined it as an up-and-coming young conductor in his native Austria. Then he went to Germany and joined the German Nazi Party, and in the process built his career excuse me, as the up-and-coming conductor who was going to replace, and did replace, the great German conductor of the era, Wilhelm Furtwängler, who was less enthusiastic about the Nazis than von Karajan was. So you've got a situation here where Kubrick is confronted with all of these connections, and he's thinking, wow, doesn't this say a lot? And it makes me think of what you said about the Harlan family, is that here Kubrick again is dealing with a great artist, Herbert von Karajan, and yet he too, like the Harlans, was the artist serving the Nazis. And, you know, you could say that Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange, basically its fundamental point is that art and evil cohabit. I mean, here's Alex, this monster of a kid, a teenager, and he loves Beethoven. And he's truly moved by it. And the cohabitation of art and evil is so clear in that film and you know, shocking. And here it is in The Shining as well. She was the niece of Veit Harlan, who was much more famous and infamous in that he was the most successful director in Nazi Germany, and he was particularly vilified after the war for a film called Jud Süß, which was intended by the propaganda ministry to convince Germans, even more than they perhaps already were, that the Jews were a present and eternal danger that must be handled in the most radical fashion.
That was confirmed to us by a former MS-13 assassin we interviewed, a man who claims to have murdered dozens of people for the gang.
And so this was the family into which Kubrick married, and it certainly must have had an impact upon him. As a Jew, he was fascinated with Veit Harlan, and he wanted to make a film about him, but never did. And the fact that his father-in-law was an opera singer, and in 1942 went to The Hague in the German-occupied Netherlands to be a member of the German theater that propaganda minister Goebbels had established there as part of Nazi Germany's cultural occupation of Europe, must have increased his interest. And as you say, perhaps the most striking thing about Fritz Harlan is that he and his wife did in fact live in housing that had been taken by Jews who in 1942 were sent off to the east to be gassed. And the Harlans, Fritz and his wife, knew this, and I've since confirmed by means of documentation that the apartments they occupied, they occupied a small one first and then got a bigger one, were both owned by Jews who were in fact sent east to Poland to be gassed. So this must have struck Kubrick as being terribly significant and in line with his view of the history of humanity. Christiana said that Stanley was fascinated by her family's, what she called, catastrophic past, and that they talked about it a great deal. He had endless questions, and she had perhaps endless answers. So here he is, a Jewish kid from the Bronx who was growing up during the rise of Nazism and the Holocaust and the Second World War, marrying into a family that was one of the major artistic families of the Third Reich. This must have affected him in a number of ways, on a number of levels. Kubrick certainly noticed that the King novel borrows from The Magic Mountain. And my argument is that Kubrick went much more deeply into this and essentially wrote The Shining on one level of discourse as a subtext, as a contemplation of the world in the wake of the Second World War, just as Mann was writing The Magic Mountain as a contemplation of the world after the First World War. I recently talked with Diane Johnson again, and I asked her, because I couldn't remember if I'd asked her all those years ago when I talked to her originally, whether she and Kubrick ever discussed The Magic Mountain. And she said, well, it's been such a long time that I don't remember. However, given the obvious similarities, I would guess that we probably did, that it did come up. Now, at the same time, Kubrick, like most artists, wasn't going to share his deepest ideas with anyone else. And so he probably didn't tell her, I think it would be a great idea to address the Magic Mountain in terms of the Second World War and the Holocaust. So she said, we never discussed anything about the Holocaust. But my view of that is that Kubrick wouldn't have laid all his cards on his table. He was, perhaps like most artists, and perhaps even more so, very private about the central ideas in his work. He wanted them to be in the work and have the audience suss them out if they could. For example, Mann has that famous chapter, Snow, and King, too, has a short chapter entitled Snow. And for Mann, that's where Hans Castorp, his protagonist, sort of goes off and gets caught in a blizzard, and he's confronted with the reality of death, but that he comes to realize that life is what really matters, and so forth and so on. Kubrick has a very brief scene in The Shining, one of the briefest scenes in The Shining, where Danny and Wendy are shown in a snowball fight during the first blizzard that they experience at the Overlook. So they're outside playing and laughing, although with typical Kubrick ambiguity, they're fighting. They're having a snowball fight. So Kubrick would do that, always make it ambiguous and open-ended. But set against that is a one shot of Jack in the Colorado Lounge with a huge fire, and the huge fireplace behind him, obviously going crazy, or rather being enslaved to do the work of the Overlook. And the Overlook, like the castle, is this great institution that demands that its authority be defended by all means possible, including murder. We know from many sources, Kubrick himself, that Kafka was his favorite artist. And that was because he found that Kafka's suspicion of the world fit with his own worldview. And the castle, there are so many similarities between King's Overlook and Kubrick's Overlook Hotel that suggests that that particular novel of Kafka's, which was published only a couple of years before, or was published just posthumously after Mann's The Magic Mountain, is an obvious parallel to King's novel and Kubrick's film of The Shining, in that you have this huge establishment, like in Mann's Magic Mountain, isolated up into the mountains. Kafka, of course, was writing about the Hradný Castle in Prague that loomed over his own little house on that same hill. And it's clear that the Overlook Hotel, like the castle, is the seat of great malevolent power, past and present. The one difference would be that Kafka portrayed the castle in the 1920s as a remainder of a system that was failing, of the old Europe, of the old aristocratic and royal Europe. Kubrick's The Shining, and people can argue about this, sees the Overlook Hotel as not only dominating the past, but the present and potentially the future. As I say, people argue about the meaning of the ending to The Shining, but I think that's an arguable position that, unlike in the novel, the Overlook Hotel in The Shining is not destroyed, but remains open. And Jack is pictured at the end in a photograph from 1921 in a tuxedo. He's sort of become the Gatsby of great evil. There's a recent essay by Anthony Magistrale that argues that Jack being in a tuxedo is very much an evocation of his critique of the 1920s elite, political and social and economic elite that is the subject of Fitzgerald's novel, The Great Gatsby. Arguably, the central symbol in the castle is the eagle. The eagle stands for authority. It stands for the ability of power over people to see everywhere. And the fact that The Shining opens with literally an eagle's eye view, it's of course a helicopter, not an eagle, of Jack Torrance in his yellow Volkswagen driving up to the Overlook, and the fact that he types on a typewriter that has an eagle on it, I think shows a direct channeling of Kafka's The Castle.
In literal biographical terms, it is undeniable that Stanley Kubrick was skeptical of communism, something made obvious by his representation of the Soviet Union's government in Dr. Strangelove. He probably was not aware of Aimé Césaire's writings, and as instead a filmmaker influenced by psychoanalytic theory, put a different lens on his camera. At the same time, it should not be a significant stretch of the imagination to ask if we can use ideas formulated by Césaire to better understand Kubrick's film, particularly because Césaire's mentee and pupil, Frantz Fanon, sought to blend psychiatry and psychoanalysis with post-colonial theory. It was Césaire who wrote in his discourse on colonialism, "We must study how colonization works to de-civilize the colonizer, to brutalize him in the true sense of the word, to degrade him, to awaken him to buried instincts, to covetousness, violence, race hatred, and moral relativism."
Did you know, Mr. Torrance, that your son is attempting to bring an outside party into this situation?
Who?
A nigger.
And we must show that each time a head is cut off or an eye put out in Vietnam and in France, they accept the fact. Each time a little girl is raped, and in France they accept the fact. Each time a Madagascaran is tortured, and in France they accept the fact. Civilization acquires another dead weight. A universal regression takes place. A gangrene sets in. A center of infection begins to spread. And that at the end of all these treaties that have been violated, all these lies that have been propagated, all these punitive expeditions that have been tolerated, all these prisoners who have been tied up and interrogated, all these patriots who have been tortured, at the end of all the racial pride that has been encouraged, all the boastfulness that has been displayed, a poison has been distilled into the veins of Europe, and slowly but surely the continent proceeds towards savagery.
Blake is interesting. I have never met anyone so deliberately amoral. He suits the climate here, the madness, the pointless butchery. As I come to understand Vietnam and what it implies about the human condition, I also realize that few humans will permit themselves such an understanding. Blake's different. He understands perfectly, and he doesn't care.